In 1944, a 14-year-old boy was led into an execution chamber. He was so small that prison guards had to place a Bible under him so the straps of the electric chair could reach his body. Moments later, the switch was pulled. Just like that, the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century was gone. His name was George Stinney Jr. For 70 years, his story remained buried in history. But when the case was finally reopened decades later, the truth shocked the world. The story begins in the small mill town of Alkaloo in South Carolina. In the 1940s, Alkaloo was deeply divided. On one side of the railroad tracks lived white families. On the other side lived black families. Those tracks were more than just steel rails. They were a line separating two very different worlds. Among the black families living near the tracks was the Stinney family. 14-year-old George lived there with his parents and several siblings. He was known as a quiet boy. Friends described him as polite, small for his age, and often helping his younger siblings. No one in town could have imagined that this boy would soon become the center of one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. On the morning of March 23, 1944, two young girls rode their bicycles through town. Their names were Betty June Binneker and Mary Emma Thames. Betty was 11 years old. Mary Emma was just 8. As they rode past the railroad tracks, they noticed George Stinney and his sister standing nearby. The girls stopped and asked a simple question. They wanted to know where they could find flowers. George reportedly told them he didn't know. The girls rode away. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. Later that day, a search began. Hours passed with no sign of the girls. Then tragedy struck. Their bodies were discovered in a ditch not far from town. Both had been brutally killed. Authorities believed the weapon may have been a heavy railroad spike. The peaceful town of Alkaloo was suddenly gripped by fear, and investigators quickly began looking for someone to blame. Very quickly, suspicion turned toward George. Police arrested the 14-year-old the same day, but the way the investigation was handled would later raise serious questions. George's parents were not allowed to be present during the interrogation. He was questioned alone. Hours later, officers claimed the boy had confessed, but there was a major problem. There was no written confession, no recording, no signed statement, nothing. Just the word of the officers. Meanwhile, tension in the town continued to rise. White residents became angry and fearful. Soon, threats began reaching the Stinney family. Fearing violence, the family was forced to flee their home. George was left completely alone in jail, far away from everyone he knew. When George's trial began, it moved incredibly fast. He was assigned a court-appointed lawyer named Charles Plowden, but the defense was almost non-existent. The lawyer called no witnesses. He conducted very little cross-examination and presented almost no evidence to defend George. The entire trial lasted about 2 hours. 2 hours to decide the fate of a child. The jury was made up entirely of white men. After hearing the case, they left the courtroom to deliberate. 10 minutes later, they returned. The verdict was announced: guilty. The judge sentenced George to death. His punishment would be execution in the electric chair. He was only 14 years old. For weeks, George waited in jail, alone, scared, separated from his family. He had no parents beside him, no siblings to comfort him, just silence and the knowledge that his execution date was approaching. Then, on June 16, 1944, the day finally came. George was taken to the execution chamber. Inside the room stood the electric chair, but it had been designed for adult prisoners. George weighed only about 95 pounds and stood around 5 feet tall. He was far too small for the chair. Prison officials had to place a Bible under him so the straps could reach around his body. Even the execution mask did not fit properly. Witnesses later said that when the electricity was turned on, the mask slipped from his face. Moments later, George Stinney Jr. was dead. He was 14 years old. After the execution, the case slowly faded from public attention. For decades, very few people talked about it, but some never forgot. Over time, lawyers and historians began asking serious questions. Where was the evidence? Why was there no written confession? Why did the defense lawyer present almost no case? And how could a trial that lasted just 2 hours decide whether a child lived or died? Many began to believe that a terrible mistake had been made. The case eventually returned to court many decades later. In 2014, a judge reviewed the trial records and evidence. After examining the case, the court made a stunning decision. George Stinney Jr.'s conviction was overturned. The ruling stated that George had not received a fair trial and that his constitutional rights had been violated. The court cleared his name 70 years after his execution. Today, George Stinney Jr. is buried at Calvary Baptist Church Cemetery. He was a child. He never got the chance to grow up, never had the chance to prove his innocence, never had the chance to live a normal life. His case remains one of the clearest examples of injustice in American history. A reminder that sometimes the truth takes decades to be heard, and sometimes justice arrives far too late.